Imagine a scenario where the world's most powerful economy faces a fiscal reckoning so profound that it alters the very foundation of global finance. This isn't a speculative fiction. It's a historical reality that unfolded in 1971, a pivotal moment when the United States effectively ran out of money. There comes a time in the life cycle of every empire when the cost of maintaining that empire exceeds its means. In the case of the United States, that inflection point came in 1971, and very few people understood the full magnitude of what happened at the time. But in retrospect, it was one of the most consequential monetary decisions in modern history. What occurred wasn't just a policy adjustment. It was a fundamental transformation in the global financial system, driven by the natural pressures that build up when you try to sustain promises that exceed your resources. Grasp what happened, you have to understand how the monetary system worked leading up to that moment. After World War II, the global economy was rebuilt around the monetary framework known as the Bretton Woods system. This system made the US dollar the world's reserve currency. Other countries agreed to peg their currencies to the dollar, and the US, in turn, committed to pegging the dollar to gold at $35 an ounce. This arrangement provided the world with stability. Gold was the anchor, the dollar was the bridge. But over time, as is typical in long-term debt cycles, the United States began spending more than it was earning. The 1960s brought a surge in government expenditures, first through expansive social programs like the Great Society, and then through the immense costs of the Vietnam War. Financing these initiatives required issuing more debt and creating more dollars, yet under the rules of Bretton Woods, the U.S. was supposed to maintain enough gold to back the dollars it issued. And that's where the tension began to build. Foreign governments, especially those with large trade surpluses like France and West Germany, started to realize that the U.S. was printing more dollars than it could redeem in gold. They began exchanging their dollar holdings for physical gold, draining the U.S. gold reserves. This wasn't speculation. It was a rational response to an unsustainable promise. By the late 1960s, the writing was on the wall. There were far more claims on U.S. gold than actual gold in the vaults. In August 1971, under intense pressure, President Nixon made a decision that would quietly alter the global financial architecture. He suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. What that meant, in essence, was that the U.S. defaulted on its promise to back its currency with anything tangible. From that point forward, the dollar became a fiat currency, valuable not because it was exchangeable for gold, but because the government said it was valuable. The world shifted overnight from a system based on hard money to one based on trust and credit. At the time, it was presented as a temporary measure. But in truth, once the connection to gold was broken, it was never restored. The global economy adjusted to the new paradigm. Markets floated, currencies fluctuated, and central banks, no longer tethered to the discipline of gold reserves, gained far more freedom to expand the money supply. That freedom, as history shows, is both a tool and a temptation. It's important to recognize what happened here in systemic terms. When the cost of maintaining the empire's promises grew too large, when military spending, welfare programs, and debt service exceeded what could be supported by tax revenues and gold reserves, the monetary system was forced to adapt. That adaptation, while necessary under the circumstances, sowed the seeds for future volatility. By severing the tie to gold, we entered an age where the value of money became more abstract, more dependent on policy decisions, and more vulnerable to human. And we've seen the consequences unfold over decades. Inflation became more volatile, Asset prices responded more aggressively to central bank actions. Debt levels climbed as there were fewer natural constraints. The cycle of boom and bust became more frequent, and wealth gaps widened as those closest to money creation, banks, corporations, asset holders benefited disproportionately. The 1971 shift didn't immediately feel like a crisis, but it marked the beginning of a new long-term cycle, a cycle in which the role of credit expanded dramatically. The dollar's dominance increased in the short term, but faced growing structural vulnerabilities in the long term. And the very foundation of trust and money began to erode. And when you understand history, you recognize that this kind of shift is part of a pattern. Every empire that finances its expansion by issuing more claims than it can ultimately meet faces a moment of reckoning. 1971 was that moment for the United States. It was not a collapse, but it was a pivot. And the implications of that pivot are still rippling through the system today. Throughout history, the accumulation of debt has followed a predictable arc. In the early stages, borrowing supports growth, stimulates productivity, and helps to build assets that justify the leverage. But as the cycle matures, borrowing increasingly shifts toward financing consumption and plugging deficits. That's when the structure becomes fragile. What we're seeing now in the United States is a textbook case of the late stage of that debt cycle, a stage characterized by escalating obligations, rising interest costs, and diminishing returns on borrowed capital. The numbers are staggering, but it's not just the scale that matters, it's the trajectory. The U.S. national debt has crossed $36 trillion, 0 cents, a figure so large that it barely registers anymore in public discourse. But what truly matters is that debt is growing faster than income. That is faster than the economy itself. When your liabilities grow more rapidly than your ability to service them, you are mathematically on a path towards some sort of adjustment, whether it be through restructuring, default, devaluation, or inflation.
This is not new. History offers countless examples. Empires tend to overspend in the pursuit of strategic and social ambitions. They borrow heavily during times of war, crisis, or political expediency, under the assumption that the future will be richer and more capable of bearing the burden. But there comes a point where the cost of servicing the debt begins to crowd out everything else. That's the phase we are entering now. In the current fiscal year, the U.S. government is expected to spend over $1 trillion just on interest payments. That's more than it spends on national defense, more than on Medicare, more than on almost any other line item in the budget. What makes this situation particularly concerning is not just the size of the interest payments, but their sensitivity to rising rates. For years, the government was able to borrow cheaply. Near-zero interest rates masked the true cost of debt and enabled the accumulation of trillions without immediate consequence. But as inflation re-emerged and central banks were forced to tighten, those days ended. Now, each percentage point increase in average interest rates adds hundreds of billions of dollars in additional annual debt service. In effect, the U.S. has built a structure that is heavily dependent on low rates, a condition that may not return for a long time. Meanwhile, the fiscal deficit remains entrenched. Tax revenues are not keeping pace with expenditures. Entitlements like Social Security and Medicare are on autopilot, driven by demographic trends that are virtually unchangeable in the short term. Political polarization makes meaningful fiscal reform extremely difficult. Every party promises more benefits, more stimulus, more support, while few are willing to raise taxes or cut spending. The result is a government that operates more and more like a household living on credit cards, refinancing old debt with new debt, hoping the future will bring relief. There is another layer to this that is crucial: trust. The U.S. benefits enormously from the fact that its currency, the dollar, is the world's reserve currency. This status allows it to borrow at lower costs and to finance its deficits by issuing debt that others are willing to buy. But that trust is not permanent. It is earned and maintained by the perception of fiscal prudence, political stability, and economic strength. When debt levels grow too high, when deficits appear unsustainable, when leadership appears dysfunctional, that trust begins to erode. Slowly at first, and then suddenly, foreign creditors who hold a significant portion of U.S. debt start to question whether it's wise to keep so much exposure in one place. Central banks begin to diversify their reserves. Investors demand higher yields to compensate for the perceived risk, and the cost of capital rises, feeding back into the debt spiral. These dynamics do not always play out overnight, but when they do unfold, they can move with remarkable speed. At the core of this issue is the simple concept of sustainability. No system can perpetually spend more than it earns. No household, no company, no country. The United States has for decades enjoyed the extraordinary privilege of being able to borrow in its own currency, to run persistent deficits without immediate consequences. But privileges, like credit lines, have limits. And when those limits are tested, the responses tend to be painful devaluation of the currency, inflation, social unrest, austerity, or combinations thereof. What we're seeing now is not just a series of bad fiscal decisions. It's the unfolding of a long-term pattern, a pattern in which debt builds slowly, then more quickly, and then becomes the dominant force shaping policy decisions. At some point, the debt begins to dictate the agenda, limiting options and forcing choices that are no longer about prosperity, but about survival and damage control. That's where the United States is heading unless structural reforms are implemented to realign spending with income, growth with productivity, and monetary expansion with tangible value creation. If history is a guide, ignoring these imbalances doesn't make them go away. It simply raises the stakes for the eventual correction in every debt cycle. There comes a moment when the act of borrowing shifts from being a productive tool to a self-perpetuating necessity. That moment is what defines the beginning of a debt spiral. It's a condition not just marked by the volume of debt, but by its quality. When new debt is no longer being used to invest in growth, but simply to pay the cost of old obligations, that's when the machine stops working the way it should and starts feeding on itself. At first, it doesn't look catastrophic. A government runs a fiscal deficit, so it issues bonds. The market absorbs them. Interest rates remain low because there is trust in the credit worthiness of the issuer. The debt is rolled over, and for a while, everything seems sustainable. But over time, the underlying math begins to shift. The principal grows. The interest payments increase. Revenues, however, do not keep up, especially if the borrowed funds are not going toward productivity, enhancing investments. Eventually, a tipping point is reached where the government must issue more debt just to cover the interest on the existing debt. That is the essence of a debt spiral. Once in motion, the spiral accelerates. The cost of servicing debt rises, either because interest rates increase or because the debt itself grows faster than GDP. Investors, sensing greater risk, begin demanding higher yields. This further raises the cost of borrowing, compounding the problem. It becomes circular. More debt leads to higher interest, which requires more borrowing, which in turn leads to even higher interest burdens. The system gets caught in a feedback loop. This is the situation many advanced economies now face, with the United States at the forefront. The country is running persistent fiscal deficits, not as a response to a temporary crisis, but as a structural feature of the budget. Entitlement spending continues to grow as the population ages. Interest on the debt is already one of the largest components of federal spending, and it's growing faster than everything else. What makes this dynamic so dangerous is not just the size of the debt, but the speed at which interest costs are compounding. When a country borrows primarily to pay interest, rather than to invest in infrastructure, innovation, or education, the future capacity to grow is diminished. That's because unproductive debt does not generate returns. It merely keeps the system afloat. And every year that goes by without addressing the underlying fiscal imbalance makes the eventual reckoning more severe. It's a bit like a business that's paying one credit card with another. It might survive another quarter, maybe another year, but the long-term outcome is baked in unless the trajectory is corrected. Monetary policy complicates the picture further. For years, central banks helped governments manage their debt loads by keeping interest rates artificially low and purchasing large volumes of government bonds. This financial repression allowed for an extended period of seemingly painless debt accumulation. But that period created distortions, mispriced risk, inflated asset prices, and a false sense of stability. When inflation returned, those tools became constrained. Now, central banks are in a bind. If they raise rates to fight inflation, they increase debt servicing costs. If they lower rates to ease debt burdens, they risk reigniting inflation and further undermining currency value. In this environment, the range of policy options narrows. Raising taxes is politically difficult. Cutting spending means confronting powerful constituencies and sacrificing programs that have become embedded in the social fabric. Inflation becomes a tempting, though dangerous, escape valve. By eroding the real value of debt, it offers a way to reduce burdens without an explicit default. But inflation is a blunt instrument. It doesn't discriminate. It hurts savers, erodes purchasing power, and sows social instability. And once unleashed, it's hard to control without creating its own set of consequences, namely recession and financial stress. Trust becomes the final pillar holding the system together. Investors continue to buy debt only as long as they believe the system remains credible. If that trust breaks, whether due to political dysfunction, monetary mismanagement, or a simple realization that the debt is unpayable, then the spiral can turn violent, capital flees, yields spike, the currency weakens. At that stage, the ability to finance deficits at acceptable terms disappears, and the country is forced into abrupt and painful adjustments. These can take many forms: forced austerity, currency devaluation, monetization of debt, but they all involve some degree of financial repression and loss of purchasing power. This isn't a theoretical risk. It's a pattern that has played out in empire after empire, economy after economy. The specific details vary, but the mechanics are always the same. Debt builds slowly at first, then rapidly. Interest payments become the largest single line item. Trust erodes, and then a reset occurs, usually in the form of a crisis. The only way to avoid that end is to intervene before the spiral becomes uncontrollable, to realign spending with income, to prioritize productive investment, and to restore a balance between the promises made and the means to fulfill them. If that doesn't happen, the spiral continues, And once it goes too far, there are no painless exits. When a leading global power undergoes a significant financial shift, the consequences extend far beyond its borders. The interconnected nature of the global economy means that the internal imbalances of one country, especially a country as systemically important as the United States, can create ripple effects that touch every corner of the world. That's exactly what we're seeing now: the growing debt burden of the U.S., the weakening of its fiscal position, and the increasing use of money printing to finance deficits are not just domestic challenges. They are structural risks for the global financial system. The U.S. dollar for decades has served as the world's reserve currency. This position has granted the United States an extraordinary advantage: the ability to borrow in its own currency, to finance trade and investment across borders, and to export its inflation. But this privilege comes with responsibilities. The world holds trillions in U.S. debt, not just as investments, but as reserves, stores of value intended to preserve wealth and ensure liquidity in times of stress. When confidence in the dollar begins to waver, it doesn't only shake America's financial foundations, it shakes the world's. Other countries, particularly those with large dollar reserves, are watching closely. They see the growing fiscal deficits, the reliance on debt monetization, and the rising interest burdens. They understand the risks. Slowly, subtly, they begin to hedge. Diversification becomes the strategy: into gold, into other currencies, into alternative systems of trade and settlement that reduce reliance on the dollar. This isn't sudden. It doesn't show up in the headlines right away. But over time, it erodes the dollar's dominance, and with it, America's ability to finance itself cheaply and project influence without cost. Geopolitically, this shift matters. Reserve currency status has been a cornerstone of American power since World War II. It has allowed the U.S. to fund its military, support its allies, and impose sanctions with teeth. But as alternatives develop, regional trade blocs, central bank digital currencies, bilateral agreements outside the dollar framework, the effectiveness of these tools begins to fade. Countries that once had no choice but to hold dollars now have options. And when trust is undermined by fiscal irresponsibility and monetary expansion, those options become more appealing. In the emerging world, the effects are particularly acute. Many developing countries borrow in dollars or peg their currencies to it. When U.S. interest rates rise, either because of inflation or because of credit risk, capital flows reverse. These countries suddenly face higher debt service costs, tighter financial conditions, and increased risk of default. Their central banks must raise rates to defend their currencies, often at the expense of domestic growth. What began as a policy decision in Washington becomes a full-blown crisis elsewhere. We've seen this before in Latin America in the 1980s, in Asia in the late 1990s, and more recently in parts of Africa and Eastern Europe. The pattern is consistent. There's also a deeper, longer-term consequence. When the leading power in the world begins to show signs of internal decay, when its finances appear unsustainable, its politics dysfunctional, and its economic model increasingly dependent on debt, confidence in the broader system begins to decline. That confidence is essential. It's what keeps markets functioning, alliances strong, and trade flowing. Without it, fragmentation increases, the rules-based global order weakens, economic nationalism rises. Trust gives way to self-interest, and collaboration is replaced with competition and conflict. In this context, inflation becomes a global concern. When a reserve currency nation prints money to finance spending, that liquidity doesn't stay at home. It flows outward into asset markets, into commodities, into global trade. It fuels bubbles and distortions. And when that liquidity is withdrawn, it creates shocks. Global markets are now highly sensitive to every move by the Federal Reserve. A hike in rates in Washington can trigger a sell-off in Jakarta, a currency crisis in Cairo, or a debt default in Buenos Aires. The fragility is systemic. Meanwhile, wealth gaps continue to widen both within and between countries. The nations with strong currencies and capital markets benefit from global flows, while those without become more vulnerable to external shocks. The same pattern exists domestically. Those who hold assets benefit from inflationary policies, while wage earners and savers fall behind. The end result is growing social unrest, populist movements, and policy volatility. These forces feed back into the global system, creating an environment of persistent instability. The world is entering a phase of transition, away from the old model of American-led globalization and into something less predictable. The U.S. debt problem is not just a domestic imbalance, it's a signal of a larger shift. The question now is not whether there will be consequences, but how severe they will be, and how the global system will adapt. Because when the core becomes unstable, the periphery cannot remain unaffected. And when trust in the center fades, the architecture of the entire system begins to change. In any enduring system, whether it's a family, a business, or a country, discipline is the foundation. When income consistently falls short of expenses, and borrowing becomes the default answer to every problem, the path becomes unsustainable. At first, it feels manageable. Debt appears to solve the issue. It bridges the gap, but over time the gap grows wider and the borrowing becomes habitual. Eventually, the system becomes dependent on it. That's where we are now. The United States has reached a stage where fiscal discipline is not just a good idea. It is an urgent necessity. The issue isn't complicated. Government spending is outpacing revenue by a wide and growing margin. Even in times of relative economic strength, deficits remain entrenched. That's a clear signal that something is structurally wrong. In a well-managed system, deficits should shrink in good times and only expand during recessions or emergencies. But what we see today is the normalization of deficit spending, regardless of the economic cycle. It's not about stimulus anymore, it's about survival. A country that cannot align its spending with its income eventually faces limits. Those limits don't appear all at once. They reveal themselves gradually through rising borrowing costs, weakening currency value, falling investor confidence, and reduced policy flexibility. And when those signals are ignored or rationalized away, the problem compounds. That's what makes fiscal discipline so essential. It's not about austerity for its own sake. It's about maintaining the flexibility and credibility to respond when true crises arise. Every government makes promises on healthcare, pensions, defense, infrastructure, education. These are long-term commitments that require sustained funding. When those promises are made without a clear plan for how they'll be paid for, trust erodes. Markets are willing to lend to governments based on their perceived capacity and willingness to repay. But when debt levels become excessive and there is no political will to correct, lenders begin to reassess the risk. Eventually, they demand higher interest rates, which only increase the burden. The cycle tightens. What was once affordable becomes unmanageable. This is where discipline comes in. It requires setting priorities, making trade, offs, and resisting the temptation to delay hard choices. That means reforming entitlement programs to reflect demographic realities. It means reviewing the efficiency of every dollar spent. And yes, it may mean increasing revenue through tax reform, but only in a way that does not disincentivize productivity and innovation. The point isn't to punish success, it's to create a system where spending and income are balanced, and where future obligations can be met without relying on monetary tricks. Over-reliance on central banks has distorted the process. For years, policymakers deferred fiscal reforms by assuming that low interest rates would continue indefinitely. Monetary easing became the first and last response to every slowdown, every market drop, every political impasse. But central banks can only do so much. They can buy time, but they can't fix structural deficits. When fiscal policy is undisciplined and monetary policy is overused, inflation becomes the mechanism of adjustment. And inflation, once embedded, is painful to control and socially destabilizing. There's also a moral dimension to this. Running persistent deficits and passing the debt burden onto future generations amounts to an intergenerational transfer of obligations without consent. Today's consumption is being financed with tomorrow's income. That undermines the principle of stewardship, of leaving the system better than we found it. Fiscal discipline, in that sense, is not just economic prudence. It is an ethical responsibility. Some argue that debt doesn't matter, especially if a country can print its own currency. That's a dangerous illusion. Printing may delay default in nominal terms, but it doesn't eliminate the cost. It simply changes the form from explicit default to implicit devaluation. Either way, the burden is paid, whether through reduced purchasing power, diminished investment returns, or increased volatility. The cost always shows up somewhere. What history teaches is clear. The countries that endure are those that maintain balance between their ambitions and their means. They invest when necessary, but are willing to pull back when conditions demand it. They build buffers in good times so they can respond effectively in bad ones. They don't allow short-term political expediency to override long-term sustainability. That's what fiscal discipline looks like. Not austerity, not rigidity, but balance and foresight. The longer this is delayed, the harder the adjustment becomes. Eventually, the correction will come, either through policy or through market force. The question is whether it will be voluntary or imposed. Fiscal discipline gives a nation control over its destiny. Without it, control slips away, and the system is left to the whims of creditors, markets, and external pressures. In that world, sovereignty is compromised, and choices become reactive instead of strategic. This isn't alarmism, it's realism. The numbers speak for themselves. The system is out of balance, and the path forward requires political courage and clarity. There is still time to restore discipline, to align spending with resources, and ensure that the country can meet its obligations without sacrificing its future. But that window doesn't stay open forever. Discipline now or disruption later, that's the choice. History offers a mirror reflecting the consequences of fiscal imprudence. The 1971 monetary shift serves as a cautionary tale of how unsustainable policies can lead to systemic upheaval. Today, the stakes are even higher. To safeguard economic stability, it's imperative for the U.S. to embrace fiscal discipline, curtail deficits, and restore confidence in its financial stewardship. By learning from the past and making informed decisions today, we can navigate toward a more stable and prosperous economic future.